Welcome to the next installment in the JA Conversation series. My name is Josh and I'm the founder of JA, a fashion brand taking a holistic approach to sustainability. In this series, we'll be talking to people who are moving things forward in their chosen field or just have great information to share, whether that be in fashion, arts and culture, or health and well-being. In this installment, I had the chance to have a conversation with Dorothy Sears, Professor of Nutrition at the Arizona State University College of Health Solutions. Our conversation focuses on circadian rhythm and time-restricted eating.
All right, so I'm Dorothy Sears. I'm a professor of nutrition at the Arizona State University College of Health Solutions. And I also have an adjunct position at UC San Diego in the Departments of Medicine and Family Medicine.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dorothy. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you and kind of get this information out to people. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So I kind of wanted to dive into the topic of time-restricted eating and how that's connected to our circadian rhythms. Could you explain what circadian rhythm is and kind of how that works and how that's like a cycle for the body?
Sure. So circadian rhythms are something that almost every living thing on the planet has, which is a 24-hour cycle, light-dark cycle, dictated by the sun, when the sun's up, when the sun's down. And the body or the cell, depending on what critter you're talking about, is going to be performing different activities, biological activities, biochemical pathways, sometimes different behaviors, depending on whether it's light or dark outside. And so in every cell, there is actually a protein system that regulates this, and it has a circadian pattern to it of this 24-hour cycle. So it goes through these cycles. And so in some parts of the body, we have proteins that are expressed during the daytime, and sometimes we have other proteins that are expressed during the nighttime. And this change in protein expression dictates what kind of biological pathways that can go on. And it influences things like nutrient metabolism, sleep, and other behaviors. Physical activity of the best time to do physical activity and those kinds of things.
Yeah. So when we first wake up and light hits our eyes, the clock starts, and that genome expression starts happening. And then as that
so you bring up
you
bring up a really important point that I should say, and that is that I mentioned the light dark, but you mentioned when we get up in the morning, the light hits our eyes.
Yeah.
So light going through our eyes and into a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is where that central clock is, and it's really driven by that light signal. There are other clocks that are driven by, let's say, nutrient signals in other parts of the body, but our primary or master clock, as it's called, is in the brain and driven by light.
Okay, so that suprachiasmatic nucleus, that's like a sensor, or it goes off when the light hits it.
And then that clock in the brain is talking to other clocks throughout the body. But that's where that master clock is. So even the liver has a clock, our skin has a clock, and they're not all doing exactly the same thing, of course, but they are talking to each other through nerves that are connecting the brain to these other parts of the body, but also things that get secreted into the circulation. Those are also part of the kind of crosstalk between these different parts of the body.
Yeah. And then so you mentioned that different parts of the body have their own clock, like the liver, for example. How do those clocks get started?
So the clocks, definitely the suprachiasmatic or the SCN is talking to the liver clock. But once we eat food, the nutrients that are getting into the blood, they are also talking to core clock pathways in the liver. And so this is why it is really important that the suprachiasmatic clock, the master clock, is in synchrony with the other clocks. So our bodies are designed, for example, to process nutrients the most effectively during the day, primarily in the morning and the midday. And then as the circadian clock is ticking in the liver, let's say, then our bodies are less able to process nutrients in the night. So when you have food at night and it's dark, your synchrony between these clock systems is askew. You have the brain thinking, hey, it's nighttime, I'm doing these things. And then you have the liver getting a nutrient signal saying, wait a minute, is it daytime? I'm getting food.
It's
and
confused.
So it gets confused.
Yeah. So once you take your first bite of food, so does drinking count? Is that so? I guess if you have a sip of water, you're still fasting. But any enzymes you have to break down or anything like that?
So there's differences of opinion about, fasting. And I don't know that anybody's ever looked to see whether actually biologically drinking water impacts the circadian rhythms. But definitely calories do. So things with some kind of nutrient, they do so. Caffeine also, there's debate on biologically whether caffeine is setting the clock. It tends to impact the circadian rhythms. However, so the folks that are the biological mouse model scientists and they're looking at how things work, they're thinking about these things. I like to think about what are people doing in the real world. So if when we're thinking about fasting, if you can fast a little longer in the morning and that a black coffee helps you do that, then I say go for it, because if I don't get my coffee in the morning, I get a headache.
Yeah. So maybe delaying your breakfast a little bit could be beneficial. Is there go on.
I think you have to tie it all together in a 24-hour clock. So I think it's not just about delaying breakfast, but it's about having a period of time during the nighttime where you completely sustain from caloric intake. And so it seems from the data that if you're stopping your food intake or greatly reducing your food intake earlier in the evening, somewhere, we don't know what the magic time is, but between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. And then abstaining from food until the next day. In our population studies, this looks like 13 hours of fasting, 12 to 14 hours is a good range of fasting time that's associated with health benefits. So if you stop eating at 6 p.m. and you want to go 14 hours of fasting, that means you don't eat till 8. So you might wake up at 6. Want a cup of coffee? You should have a cup of coffee. But I don't think that skipping breakfast and going fasting all the way into the lunch period, I think that has its own problem.
I guess, you might end up eating later as well. If you do that, you might not start getting hungry for dinner until a lot later.
Well, and there are other things too, like, and again, these are things that are kind of educated guesses. They haven't been formulated. What I'm going to tell you now hasn't been formally tested. But if you're fasting for a particularly long period of time, and then your day starts, you're going to go commute to work, COVID aside, we're going to get in the car, drive to work. If you've been fasting for a long period of time, I suspect, and I experienced this myself, that if I have some kind of scary experience, a fight or flight type of experience, that then the blood glucose drops because you've been maintaining it. Your body's very good at maintaining your glucose level, but when you have an acute challenge, a stressor, that can drop your glucose. And we know that is not good for the body long term when you're experiencing that. So I suspect that that's one reason why skipping breakfast and waiting for a long period of time just is not overall good for the body.
Okay. You drop your glucose level. Okay. And then that will bring about like a cortisol release, and that's bad, or
exactly. Those fight or flight hormones. Well, cortisol has a circadian rhythm, but epinephrine and norepinephrine, those are the things they tell your body we got to run. So the glucose in your blood gets taken up by the tissues, so you can energize your muscle and your tissues, and you could run from the lion. Now your body will respond very quickly, and the liver, your brain will sense that the glucose now is low in the bloodstream. So then the liver starts to pump out glucose. So this period of a little bit of hypoglycemia doesn't last very long, but it triggers this stress response in the body that I think on the long term is not a good thing. So I don't like to advise people to fast for longer than about 14 hours because we find that that's helpful. I don't know that there's any additional benefit to fast longer than 14 hours. And then if you're trying to fast for 18 hours, then you're going to run into, you're going to run into those periods of risk, what I think are a little bit risky.
Exactly.
Now some people will start their fast at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So then they're going to have breakfast at 6 a.m. and they're not going to have that window of time of which they can be exposed to some stressful experience. But when I think about intervention, we want to think about what is real life. And people have dinner with their families. They go meet people for dinner when COVID isn't around. So stopping eating at 2 o'clock is socially, it doesn't fit into our social structure very well. So I like to think about really practical ways of controlling the timing of your food intake and your fasting that fits in the daily life.
No, I'll say, how would you recommend people manage that? Because obviously you want to try and have, like you were saying, a decent amount of gut rest at night, so not eating too late. But there are those social pressures to, I don't know, maybe go out for dinner and see for like how do you
So, well, there's a really interesting mouse study done in Sachin Panda's lab at Salk, where they looked to see, had been doing the time-restricted feeding studies in the mice, and they found this to be very effective for controlling obesity and metabolic dysfunction, or, when your metabolism wasn't working right. And one of the folks in the lab said, well, what if the mice could eat whenever they wanted on the weekend, but only Monday through Friday we do the time-restricted feeding.
Okay.
And the mice had the same metabolic benefit as if they were doing it every day. So as a clinical researcher, I find this very exciting because, let's say on the weekend, you want to go out with your friends and have a late dinner, or you want to have a glass of wine at 9 o'clock at night. It seems like if you have a day or maybe even 2 days off a week, that this is still going to be okay in the long term. And I don't think of this eating pattern as a diet or something I'm going to do for a short period of time. I try to do it all the time. So it's a long game. And so a day off, 1 or 2 days off a week, it seems okay that it might be okay for humans. It definitely is okay for mice. And so this is another thing that needs to be tested, in controlled studies.
So kind of
very promising.
So treating it like a lifestyle, and then one or two dips here and there isn't gonna do too much damage.
Exactly.
And so eating kind of in the first half of the day is important because we're most insulin sensitive at that point.
Yeah, exactly. We are most insulin sensitive during the morning and the midday, and then our bodies become progressively less sensitive to the hormone insulin throughout the day. Even the tissue, the pancreas that secretes the insulin, is on a circadian clock, so you don't have as much insulin secretion at night. So it doesn't work as well on the target tissues, and it also doesn't get secreted as much. So the negative outcome of that is that you get a higher glucose concentration in the blood after your dinner meals than you would having the same meal at breakfast or the same meal at lunch. And then, the later you go into the night, the worse it gets. Because essentially the body is shifting gears. The body is saying, I want to start growing now. I don't want to be receiving nutrients. So things like growth hormone are stimulated in a pulsatile fashion, but the pulses get larger in the night. And growth hormone and insulin work against each other. They don't like to be in the same place, in the same sandbox. And another hormone too that's secreted at night is melatonin, and that's what's helping us sleep, and also suppressed by light. So melatonin, it gets secreted in the nighttime, and melatonin and insulin also counteract each other. So these are some kind of kind of circadian hormonal pathways that are really controlling not just our ability to process nutrients, but our sleep quality, alertness, and things like that.
So yeah, you mentioned that can affect your sleep quality, and so what are some of the detrimental effects of kind of eating late into the evening/night? What are those?
Mm-hmm. So quite a bit. So we just to touch on sleep a little bit. This has not been formally tested, but this is something that we have some ongoing studies where we're looking at sleep. But we know in some interventions that people just when they're asked about sleep, they self-report that they get better sleep quality when they're doing a time-restricted feeding or prolonged nightly fasting regimen. I even have friends that I have told about this pattern of eating, and I didn't say anything about sleep, and then they come back to me and say, oh my God, I'm sleeping so much better. So I think this is going to be a really exciting area of research to come. We know that there's a lot of negative health outcomes that are associated with eating at night, disease-wise. So for example, higher incidence of breast cancer, prostate cancer, cardiovascular disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes as well. In our controlled studies where we're actually measuring the chemicals in the blood and blood pressure, we know that eating at night is associated with higher blood pressure, higher insulin, and higher glucose, and a larger waist circumference, which we don't want that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. and so then the problem is, like you said, your body's shifting into that kind of growth mode and repair mode at night, and you've got a whole heap of sugar coming in, or glucose that it needs to deal with, and it's not quite sure how to do that, or that glucose gets left and turns into fat. Is that how it?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know whether conversion of glucose into fat is more efficient at night than it normally is, but I do know that if you just that the glucose is hanging out in the blood for longer. Normally when we eat a meal, the glucose molecules that come from that meal are, they enter into the bloodstream, and then the hormone insulin is going to tell the tissues in our bodies to take up the glucose, get it out of the blood.
Okay.
And so at night, this is not happening as effectively. So the glucose concentrations stay high in the blood for a longer period of time while insulin is trying to do its job. And what happens when the blood glucose is high is that you get kind of a sugar coating of proteins that are in the vasculature, in your blood vessels. Even hemoglobin in our red blood cells gets sugar coated. And so there's an actual clinical biomarker called hemoglobin A1C. And hemoglobin A1C is what doctors look at to see if people who have diabetes have been controlling their glucose. Because the more glucose molecules on the hemoglobin, the worse their glucose control has been.
Oh, okay.
So you can imagine a protein that has, proteins it's very important that their structure is maintained. If now the structure of your protein is getting peppered with glucose molecules around it, it's not going to fit or function as well as it normally would because of these. They're called glycation reactions. And they're permanent. So once that protein is
damaged,
recycled, it sticks around. So hemoglobin A1C is a clinical biomarker, but there are all kinds of other proteins, like I say, the lining of the small blood vessels that get damaged. And so, for example, in type 2 diabetes, when we think about the complications of type 2 diabetes to the retinal, loss of sight, loss of nerve sensation in the extremities, the fingertips and the toes. This is a lot because this is primarily due to those glycation reactions that are inhibiting the normal functioning of those little vessels in your retina or whatnot, and the kidney too. So the more we can improve glucose control with this fasting at night, eliminating eating at night, or at least late at night, this should reduce risk for diabetes and related comorbidities like cardiovascular disease and other things.
And so dementia as well. Okay. And so are those reactions causing inflammation, and that's where things are going wrong? Or you're just damaging the protein and it doesn't?
So high glucose in the blood can cause what's called oxidative stress. And so the oxidative stress creates very reactive molecules that can trigger inflammation. So absolutely, that is also happening.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And so somebody who maybe has chronic disease or diabetes, how can they use time restricted eating to help that?
So for people with type 2 diabetes, I think you want to first consult your physician, let them know what you want to do. People have been trying all kinds of regimens with type 2 diabetes patients. I think that just either eliminating food intake at night, let's say, no food after 7 or 8 p.m., will help a lot.
Okay.
In our studies, we show that consumption of less than 30% of your calories at night is associated with better health measures, for example, the blood glucose or the blood pressure and so forth, versus people who have more than 30% of their calories at night. I think this gets to another social issue, is that typically in the Western world, our biggest meal is the dinner.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think part of this is a reframing of social habits and thinking about, okay, I need to eat a bigger breakfast and lunch and have a small dinner. So I think people with type 2 diabetes could definitely benefit from that. There have been published so far a relatively few number of what we call randomized controlled trials of time-restricted feeding or prolonged nightly fasting. There are some new big trials funded right now, and I just have a new one funded from NIH myself. So
okay, great.
This data will get better, but some studies have included people with type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, and so far there doesn't seem to be any safety concern in these populations, which is very promising.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned pre-diabetes there. What is that? Is that you kind of the A1C you mentioned, is that like you can see the glucose is high or it's starting to get high and then?
That's correct. Yeah. So both the fasting glucose is high, but not in the clinical classification of type 2 diabetes. The changes happen gradually, so it's early on. And then also the hemoglobin A1C is also elevated. So there's kind of a cutoff for diabetes. So if you cross over the line, you have diabetes, but before then there's kind of a range that they call pre-diabetes.
Okay. So if you did have pre-diabetes and you caught it early and you tried this, you could reverse that potentially and not cross over the line?
So I think that you could at least slow the trajectory and improve that hemoglobin A1C. We know that a lot of different lifestyle interventions can delay the onset of type 2 diabetes. Unfortunately, there's a strong genetic component for risk of type 2 diabetes. So some folks are probably going to get diabetes later, someday, but the more you can delay the onset, the better off for your long-term health. So I think everybody could benefit from just trying to think about ways that can control their glucose. And the nice thing about the fasting regimens and time-restricted feeding is that you don't have to read labels to do it. You just look at the clock.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another question, I guess, is how much does diet quality play a part in what you're eating? Or is it more about just getting within those time frames?
Yeah, so this is also a really interesting question, and the NIH has just released a bunch of funds for research. People are applying for these now to look at these more intricate questions. So if I'm doing time-restricted feeding, can I still eat McDonald's hamburgers? In the mouse, this works in the mouse. So in the mouse, they're eating very high-fat chow, this high-fat pellets in their cage. And if you just do the time-restricted feeding, the metabolic benefit is enormous, and you don't change the food quality. We don't know whether this is going to work in humans or not. And also, it may be that the mice, when they're eating for only 8 hours, they still eat the same number of kilocalories. So they kind of catch on like, oh, I only get food for 8 hours, so I'm going to eat all the calories.
It down.
But it's interesting because in humans, it appears that in some people, they tend to eat less when they're doing the time-restricted feeding.
Okay.
And so another circadian rhythm is that is a behavior of food intake. So we normally have a satiety signal when we feel full. And that's, some of those satiety signals are in circadian rhythms, so that they don't work as well at night. So if you're eating at night, you might eat more calories at night than you would, because you're not getting that satiety feedback to the brain.
Yeah. So you don't get that feeling of being full, or you don't get that message, and you could just keep going. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, I learned this recently. So when your stomach enlarges, when the food gets in there, your stomach enlarges, that's stretching. It's like just a physical stretching signal that is connected to some nerves that go up to the brain. And they tell the brain, hey, the stomach is stretching, and the brain says, hey, okay, we're full, stop eating.
Yeah.
That is under circadian control.
Wow.
So that signaling doesn't work as well at night, which explains maybe why people, when they're snacking at night, they might eat more than they were snacking in the afternoon.
Yeah. And so what's control? So yeah, I guess the gut isn't, and the liver are not controlled by light, but obviously, like you said, the first intake of food, and then so you've got those 12 hours to kind of finish eating.
Yeah. Now the liver isn't detecting light directly, but it is listening to the circadian, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is telling it that it's light or dark.
Yeah, and then so within that, obviously people eat kind of 3 times a day roughly, but then some people kind of snack in between those times. Does that have any effect?
That's a really good question too. So there are there's research going on looking at the frequency of meals.
Yeah.
Like we have a lot of little meals. Is that better than having 3 meals? And I think the jury is still out on that. We don't know. And I think what we need to layer onto that research and to the interpretation of the findings is, what time are these things happening?
Yeah.
Because the frequency thing, if you are eating frequently, but you're eating frequently well into the night, then that's bad, versus somebody who's eating frequently, but only within a particular frame of time that is in alignment with the circadian clock.
Yeah.
Oh, I had one thought too that I wanted to tell you. So about what type of food does it matter?
Yeah.
So there's a study out of Hong Kong looking at the incidence of breast cancer in women. And so women who eat after 10 o'clock had a higher risk of breast cancer. It was a very large population. So they were able to say, well, what if the women were eating just fruits and vegetables after 10 o'clock? And when they looked at that group did not have an increase of breast cancer risk, even though they're eating fruits and vegetables after 10 o'clock. So I suspect that it will matter what you were eating at night. And I think this is very promising for shift workers. We have a very high percentage of shift folks in the Western world who do shift work.
Yeah.
And they don't really have any choice about it. It's even the International Cancer Society has described shift work as a carcinogen.
Wow.
Because the evidence is so strong.
Wow.
So what do we do for those folks? So if we can determine fruits and vegetables at work for you are good, or have a salad, and then have your big meal when you get home at 6 a.m. So these kinds of questions are things that we really need to answer so that we can help those communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say, shift workers is a big one, isn't it? Because obviously their sleep is affected, and then their eating habits change. So if there is something they can eat that kind of offsets some of that damage that might occur, that's amazing.
Exactly. And then with the shift workers, it's even more complicated than just food, right? Because they're exposed to the light. They're exposed to light at night, so their central clock in the brain is confused as well. So what do you do about that? And so we do have blue light blocking goggles. I actually use these myself at home after 8 p.m. I put them on. But you can't have a shift worker put on blue light blocking goggles, because now they probably get sleepy.
Yes. That melatonin kicks in.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay, that's really interesting. And then so does age play a part at all in kind of your resistance to some of these things? Like if you're kind of late teens, early 20s, and you out partying, eating late, is that going to catch up with you, or is it are you pretty
Yeah,
resilient at that age?
yeah, it's a really good question. As we age, we just become more insulin resistant.
Okay.
So I'd imagine that older folks will have a more detrimental effect, or eating at night will have a more detrimental effect on them because they already have that layer of insulin resistance
Yeah.
because of their age. So younger folks might be a little more resilient, and have just a really great insulin sensitivity. And so even though sensitivity is relatively lower at night, it's still pretty good for them.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting, yeah, to look at different age groups for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And you mentioned that breast cancer trial you did, and I think I saw a study where you looked at recovery rates and the likelihood of relapsing with the cancer.
Yes.
Could you tell me a bit about that? What was?
Yeah, so this was a study of the data that was generated. We analyzed data from a study called the Women's Healthy Eating and Living Trial, WELL.
Mhm.
So the WELL participants, there are over 3,000 women breast cancer survivors in this study, and they were enrolled in, either a weight loss diet, which was low fat, high fruits and vegetables, or control condition, and then they were monitored out over 10 years time.
Okay.
And during that time, they were, because it was a diet intervention, they were collecting data about what were they eating, what time are they eating. So we had all this, what we call time-stamped data. So we were able to go back to those records and look at, well, what time were people eating? So from all these over 3,000 women, we were able to look at 30,000 food recalls that were time-stamped. And then over the period of this 10 years follow-up of these ladies, they were keeping track of who got breast cancer again, or who died of cancer, or died of anything. So mortality outcomes and breast cancer. And so the student who was working with us at the time, Catherine Marinac, what she was able to show was that the women who fasted for less than 13 and a half hours had a 36% increase in breast cancer recurrence compared to the women who fasted for at least 13.5 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. And there was also associations with sleep. So longer duration of fasting was associated with longer duration of sleep. But these are association studies, not intervention studies. So we don't know that the fasting is affecting sleep directly, or just people who fast more go to bed early. We don't know.
Yeah.
But that was a really exciting study. And to this day, that is the only fasting, the only data showing what we call a clinical outcome associated with fasting.
Okay.
So clinical outcome is you get cancer, or you have a heart attack, or something like that, versus a biomarker where you're looking at hemoglobin A1C or something.
So it's pretty strong data to say this is the likely outcome, or if this is the outcome.
It is a strong association data. So so the best test is what we call a randomized controlled trial. So you recruit individuals, you have a control group, you have an intervention, you actually change what they're doing. And so we now, I and other folks in the United States are doing research with actually doing these randomized control trials, take individuals who fast for less than 12 hours and then increase their fasting time, and how does that change their health outcomes?
Yeah. And so when do you think you'll see kind of some of the outcomes from those trials?
So one of them is being conducted by Courtney Peterson at the Pennington Institute. I think she is probably going to have data in about 4 years. And I don't know how much COVID has delayed her. So all of us doing clinical trials have been a little bit slowed down by COVID. So I think she'll have her data in about 5 years. My trial is just getting started. I'm collaborating with Julie Pendergast at the University of Kentucky. So we will start enrolling individuals probably in the fall, and it's a 5-year overall study. So the intervention is only 12 weeks, but we will have our data 5 years from now, essentially. So it takes a while to get the data.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you seen kind of any kind of like kind of, I guess, maybe association or observation from like cultural differences, like different cultures eating kind of at different times and
Yeah,
anything like that?
I'm glad that you asked me that because I almost always get a question. Well, what about in Spain? Because in Spain they always eat late at night,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so there's a couple things. So one is that the people in Spain, just to use that country as an example, they have a lot of different health behaviors than we have in the United States. So for example, they walk a lot.
Mm,
They use the stairs a lot, a lot more than people in the United States.
yeah.
So they have those kind of health behaviors. So yes, they're eating at night. But Spain also has an obesity problem.
Okay.
Obesity is an epidemic around the world where
Yeah.
people have plentiful food. As long as there's no food scarcity, we have obesity.
Yeah.
So Spain is not immune to that. They Another health behavior that the Spanish have is that they eat smaller portions
Mm,
than the United States. So
yeah.
yes, they're eating at night, but there are some other factors there. And then there are two studies that are really interesting that are in a Spanish population. They were analysis of data from two different weight loss trials. One was a study looking at weight loss after bariatric surgery, and one was a study just looking at, reduced calorie weight loss standard. And what they said was, let's look at this data. They knew when people were eating, when their meals were, and how big they were. So they said, well, does it matter in these populations when they eat their biggest meal? And what they found was that the women, I don't know that they were all women, the individuals in this trial, if they had their biggest meal at lunchtime,
Yeah.
they lost more weight than the people who ate their biggest meal at dinner. And this
Yeah.
is in Spain, in
Yeah.
Spain. So the biology, I think, is pretty universal,
Yeah.
at least in kind of European, Western world populations. There's some studies out of Korea and one in Japan that suggest that fasting doesn't have any benefit for those individuals. But just looking at fasting time takes away some of the assessment of whether the food intake is happening during the day or during the night and what proportion in the day. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of different dimensions to examine in these.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting what you're saying about obviously portion size. So for those shift workers who are eating late, as we said, maybe just reducing that portion size that they do have could help as well.
Yeah. Because if the portion is small, then that's less glucose getting into the blood,
Yeah.
or something that doesn't have very much glucose, like fruit and vegetables, it depends. As long as it's not a fruit smoothie, those have a lot of sugar.
Yeah. Don't pile that up.
Whole fruit.
Yeah.
Whole fruit, a salad, some lean meat, maybe, that's a dietary plan that would be effective for them.
Kind of limit the carbohydrates later on to the evening. Yeah. And then, so have you seen kind of anything with people of different races or anything like that? Any changes?
So again, the studies have been quite small for the intervention. In the well study, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of racial or ethnic diversity in there. We have done a pilot study of the prolonged nightly fast, we call it ProFast, prolonged nightly fasting intervention.
Yeah.
And we did 2 groups of 10 women, and one group we went to the South County of San Diego, and we enrolled lower socioeconomic status Latina women. So these are postmenopausal women, and with a different family structure than our other population, which was in La Jolla, California, predominantly white, college educated, And so we did the study in both of them just to see whether it was feasible. Because again, with the family and cooking dinner at night, does this work for those ladies? And can they achieve the goal, which was to fast for at least 12 hours every night? And they were just as capable and excited about it as the women in La Jolla. So, in that one, it was just a trial to look at what we call feasibility. Like, does this work? Does this regimen work in people's lives? And so we saw a modest amount of weight change, but it was just a short 1 month intervention, and the change was not statistically significant. So this needs to be replicated in larger populations. But at least the social contexts that were so different seem to not bias the efficacy of, I should say, the feasibility of the intervention.
Yeah, that's interesting. And
Yeah.
then you mentioned like weight loss there. Like, is there any kind of other health benefits? I think I read a study that, or maybe the mice increase muscle mass when they stop eating after a certain time.
I don't know about the muscle mass one.
Okay.
In our studies, the mice don't, we fatten them up, so they're really obese when we start.
Yeah.
So we fatten them up first, and then we split the mice into two groups. And one, they just keep eating whenever they want, which pretty much is 24 hours a day they eat. And then the other group, we only let them have the food for 8 hours. So they lose a little bit of body weight in the beginning, and then they stabilize.
Yeah.
If we look at their fat mass, if we can look inside the mice and we look at the fat mass is shrinking. And interestingly, the fat that is in the liver of those obese mice goes away.
Wow.
Fatty liver is a huge problem in the United States and the Western world. It goes along with obesity. Even in young children, fatty liver is a problem. Wow. So the fact that the time-restricted feeding is reducing this fat in the liver was really exciting. The insulin, the fasting insulin levels go down, which tell us that the mice are becoming more insulin sensitive. So a lot of biologically metabolic benefits happen that the magnitude of that far exceeds the magnitude of the weight change.
Yeah.
I think it gets to another thing in our society. I mean, I think weight loss is good, but a lot of people are thinking about, oh, I want the number on the scale to get smaller. Yeah. And we do, and that's a good thing. But when you start a regimen like time-restricted feeding, it's possible that you could be having metabolic benefit and not see a change on the scale. They're just changes that we cannot sense or we can't measure without taking a blood sample or something like that.
Yeah. And arguably those changes are better, right? Like you want to reduce the fat in your liver, and
right.
And some of the changes that you can see or notice are like better sleep and things like that is definitely gonna help you recover properly and help your brain and all of that.
Exactly. We have a small trial going on right now to see whether if the time-restricted feeding will improve cognition in older adults who have mild cognitive impairment. We know that cognitive decline is associated with these high levels of glucose exposure. So people with diabetes are more likely to have cognitive decline than people without diabetes. So we are optimistic that we'll see some improvements in cognition. One of my colleagues at Arizona State, Carol Johnson, has started doing some small pilot studies in the undergrads at Arizona State, so relatively young population, and showing she's found some evidence that mood improves.
Okay, yeah.
So it's going to be really exciting to see all the new studies that come out.
Yeah, definitely. And is that the kind of link you were saying with dementia earlier? Is that how that would happen, like higher levels of glucose at night, and I guess your brain's not dealing with that or clearing that away? Or
exactly, because that vascular damage that I mentioned can be happening in the brain, and then that interferes with our ability to get oxygen to the brain and nutrients.
Okay, wow. And is there kind of any studies out there looking at maybe how this could be used for peak performance, and maybe athletes want to look at this? Or
yes, there are a few studies looking at they're very small.
I can imagine.
But I think there's promise. There. And sometimes they're kind of mixed with it's prolonged nightly fasting plus strength training. So they mix a lot of interventions at the same time. So sometimes in those designs, it's hard to determine what was the most effective factor in the results. So, but I think there's promise there. Also debate on what time of day is the best time to exercise.
Yes.
Because we know that for example, that our greatest muscle strength and cardiovascular strength, our best coordination is in the afternoon, the later afternoon. Okay. So is that when we want to exercise? Is that when we want to play our sports? And then the exercise scientists will say, well, if you can get people to exercise any time of day, that's a good
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
So
yeah,
don't confuse people about what time of day. But I know for elite athletes, of course, this is something that they might be able to capitalize on to improve their
yeah,
performance.
yeah. And I think I saw another study as well, saying something endurance was improved, like the kind of the earlier um, people stopped eating, or I can't remember if this was in people or mice, but earlier stopped eating, they had better endurance the next day.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, and like you said, finding out about the time as well would be.
Yeah, and then is that because they got better sleep and then they
Mm,
had better endurance? So
yeah, yeah,
these things are so linked. And so when we design our studies, we're trying to measure all these things at the same time. So we have people wearing, wrist accelerometers and things that we can use to objectively measure sleep time. Even you're probably familiar with the continuous glucose monitor. This is a device that people with type 1 diabetes first were wearing.
okay.
It measures a glucose level every 5 minutes, and you can even have an app on your phone to measure
Oh, that's cool. Yeah,
the glucose and see what your glucose is. So this helps them keep their glucose in control because they can see it so often and don't have to prick their finger all the time.
yeah.
So now it's becoming more common for people with type 2 diabetes to wear these, to use these, and then also for researchers to use them. So if I'm asking somebody, when did you last eat? They may tell me the truth. They may not. They may forget. I forgot that I had some Cheetos at 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
But with a continuous glucose monitor on, I can see
You get
at
that
least
time.
when they have the carbohydrate. I can see that come.
That spike, yeah.
So I think combining these different devices, wearable devices that objectively measure our body's rhythms, our sleep activity rhythms, our physical activity, the glucose. There's another device called an eye button that you can wear. It measures the skin temperature.
Okay.
Also circadian.
Yeah.
Heart rate rhythms are circadian.
Oh, yeah,
So some Fitbit and some other devices will measure this, what's called heart rate variability. And if you have a high level of variability with the heart rate variability, this is a good thing, and also linked to endurance and performance.
Yeah.
So we're interested in adding that device as well. So our study participants are going to be rigged up so we can really watch them, because we need to see the 24-hour pattern.
Yeah. And that heart rate variability one is an interesting one. It'd be interesting to see how time restricted eating affects that and what it does.
Absolutely. Well, I look at my sleep data every morning when I wake up, and I have a Fitbit. So I'm looking at that. And so there's a time about 4:30 in the morning that we all have our lowest body temperature and the lowest heart rate. So I'm always looking at, did I have that dip? We know that people who don't have that dip have increased risk for cardiovascular disease.
Yeah.
I'm looking at this data, and I notice if I do eat late at night, then my heart rate is higher way into the night. And hopefully I still get a little bit of a dip, but you can see your heart rate data is affected by the time late night food intake. Yeah.
Wow. That's huge as well for people to monitor that. So what kind of regimen do you do? What kind of routine do you follow?
Yeah, so I try to fast for at least 12 hours every night. And I try to eat no later than 8. I very rarely eat any calories after 8 p.m. I try to eat as early as possible, but again, it's difficult with the family or with your work if you're in the office till later. It's not always so pleasant to eat dinner in your office.
Yeah, exactly. It's not nice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I try to make a mental note. What time am I eating? It's dinner time at 6:30. Then that means, after 6:30, I can eat. But so I usually go 8 hours. I'm usually fasting at least 12 hours. I also try not to go more than 14. So my goal is kind of 12 to 14.
In that window, yeah. Nice. Have you kind of seen this becoming more popular, more people kind of getting in touch? Is the momentum around this growing? People kind of cottoning onto this, or?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. If you Google it, I Googled it the other day. I can't remember how many hits it was, like millions of hits in Google about, intermittent fasting, and people are writing books. I think we still have a lot of things to learn from properly designed research trials about what the best regimen is. So because the mouse studies have an 8-hour feeding window and then 16 hours of fasting, you have a lot of people wanting to do that.
Yeah.
I don't think from our population data, it doesn't look like you need to fast for 16 hours to get a benefit. And it just seems like that's kind of a torture. So, I just don't know that that's necessary. What works isn't necessarily what is required. There was one study looking at an 18-hour fast. So there's some pretty long fasts. And again, I think of it as a lifestyle. So I don't know that I could do an 18-hour fast forever,
exactly.
And so I think individuals should think about what works for them in their lifestyle, and shoot for at least 12 hours of time where you're not putting any calories into your mouth, and try to align your food intake with the daytime, because that is when your body is ready to receive and properly handle those nutrients.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you said, getting back into the cycle. Yeah, in the Western world, it's 24 hours a day. Everything's go, go, go.
Exactly.
Yeah. So trying to get back in touch with nature and the rhythms is super, super important for people.
Yes. And I think also the light too, is something to think about. It's something that we can control. So we can turn down lights in our room, in the living room when you're watching television. Like I say, I often put my blue light blocking goggles on to watch television after 8 p.m. On the computer, if you're working on a computer or your phone, most devices you can turn off the blue light at night. It has a setting that you can control your blue light, and it really impacts my when I get sleepy. If I put on those blue light blocking goggles, and by 9 o'clock, I'm ready.
Ready to zone
I'm ready to go to bed.
Yeah, absolutely. Light is so important with that, and blue light especially. So, not being on the computer right before you go into bed, or your phone, and like you said, switching it to night mode. I didn't really know that it had a night mode until quite recently. So, I've been
really
using
nice
that
they have that.
I know.
It's nice
Amazing.
And sometimes I'll be working on a computer and it's 8 o'clock and the computer starts to change the color. Like, no,
It starts to dim down.
I can't believe I'm working that late.
It reminds you, doesn't it? Like you're still going. You should be starting to relax. Yeah. What are those blue light goggles you use? Is that a specific brand or mate?
The brand is Uvex, UVEX, and I just found them on eBay. They look like safety goggles, and they're yellow.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I'm gonna have to get a pair of those.
And then a lot of devices that we have a little blue light, like some light switches now have a little
like
blue light.
Standby mode kind of thing.
Exactly. So I also found online some little stickers, so you can put the sticker over those little blue light things to really be careful of that blue light influence, because our bodies are really sensitive to the light. And the dim blue light in your bedroom particularly is detrimental for your sleep. It will suppress your melatonin secretion.
So people like maybe with like alarm clocks on the side table that's got a little blue light on it, that's affecting your melatonin release.
Exactly. And if you really like your alarm clock, they do have kind of films, so you can buy the film and then cut it and then paste it over your the light. So or get one with a red light.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Philips do like a whole light range, don't they, whereby you can adjust it or the time of the day, like you said, with your computer at a certain time it changes.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So I have a couple of light bulbs in the house where it's these lamps that I use for my night light, and it's plenty of light, but there's no blue light that comes out of that bulb. Those bulbs are not cheap, but they're LEDs, so they'll last a long time. But you can buy bulbs like that, and the ones like you said that change. Those are really fancy ones.
Those are fancy ones.
But I think this is when we think about the changes in modern, when you think about what is modern life going to look like, I think we're going to have automatically dimming lights. And when I say dim, it even doesn't have to be dimming. It just can be elimination of the blue light, because you can have bright light that looks white, but it doesn't have any blue light. So people are working on developing these types of light bulbs as well. So I think that, maybe put a lock on the refrigerator that turns on at 8 o'clock.
Yeah. I guess when everything goes smart, you won't be able to open your fridge at past 8 o'clock or something like that.
Yeah. even things like that are sorry, distracted. Blinds that automatically rise in the morning time would be really amazing.
Yeah.
My husband likes to sleep with the curtains tight and black. And the problem is that then I don't want to wake up.
Yeah, you're just
I'm very sensitive to the light. So I like sleeping with the windows open, and then when the sun rises, I can see that.
Yeah. Exactly. And then you get that, what's that, melatonin? Is that the one that comes in when you're the hormone? The opposite of melatonin, basically. Yeah. That kicks in and you're ready to go. So
exactly.
getting out in that blue light early in the morning is really important.
Yes. I also try to do that as well. So in the morning, I like to go sit outside, check my email, have my coffee, and just be outside, so that my brain is recognizing, okay, it's the daytime now. Yeah. And studies show that if you have that bright light exposure during the day, it doesn't have to be a lot, just like 15 minutes even, that makes you more resistant to the blue light at night, because your brain already knows, like, this is morning. Yeah. And so when you have a little bit of blue light in the evening after a morning like that, your brain doesn't get confused, because it had such a strong entraining signal from the morning. Yeah. So people who get that outdoor time, even on a cloudy day, the light outside is much brighter than any bulbs we can have on the inside. So just having that will help you to be more resistant to any blue light that happens to be in your environment at night.
Yeah, and just help you regulate, and like you said, get that clock started properly. Which is another thing in society. Obviously, people living in apartments that aren't well lit, or not enough windows, and things like that.
Yes. And it's very interesting, again, coming back to like social issues, like how do we help people learn about getting outside? What if they're in a place that's not safe to be outside, or it's too cold to be outside, or I live a lot in Phoenix, so it's too hot to be outside. You would think that in Phoenix we'd all get a lot of sun, but in the summertime nobody does, because everybody's inside. So just communicating that to folks, that if they can't be outside, just sit next to a bright window if you can. You think about architects. What are the window designs of the future that'll help more light in?
Yeah, there's so many areas of innovation to happen, and
absolutely.
And it's good that people are starting to think about that and starting to work on that.